And we're live.
Welcome to this session where we will discuss EU legislation on the topic of utilization and deployment of AI apps. I would like to welcome our guest today, Mike Charles Borrelli. He's expert in regulation. And Mike, please present yourself so the audience will know your story and what you work on.
Good to see you, Peter. Thank you for having me on, and it's a pleasure to be here with this Swarm AI community. You guys are doing a great job. So my name is Michael Borrelli. I work with AI Partners. My background is financial services. So basically spent my entire career in governance, risk, and compliance. And I joined the team at AI Partners 3.5 years ago. AI Partners is an AI governance vendor and consulting company, which was started by my business partner, Sean, 4 years ago. And what inspired him is the work that he did on the implementation of GDPR. If we go on the analogy that data, as Sean would say, if data is the new gasoline, then AI is the combustion engine. And GDPR is the regulation of the data. And the next logical progression is the regulation of the combustion engine. So AI Partners was formed to help companies implement the regulation that is designed to regulate the combustion engine.
Thank you for this introduction. Uh, just allow me a bit more explanation for all the people that are not from the EU. EU has one of the strictest regulation of data with GDPR, as mentioned by Michael, and one of the most strict regulation as far as utilization and development of AI is concerned, if you are targeting EU consumers or EU companies. So I would like to start right away with the question: how much does a EU compliant AI app differ from a non-compliant app, and what are the main differences, and what should developers expect when entering EU market? What are the restrictions? Where are the limitations? What do you think is the most or the key thing to pay attention to when developing or when planning to go into EU market?
God, quite a few questions there, Peter. So I'll try and do my best and provide some answers that cover a group of them all together, because I think some of them are fairly similar in nature. The first question, I believe, is the difference or distinction between a compliant versus non-compliant product.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in a simple way, ones that are compliant are more, they have the systems controls mandated by the EU AI Act, and they will have been risk classified. So if you have a high-risk system as mandated by the EU AI Act, you would have to put several things in place, like a quality management system, risk management system, and have it registered in the high-risk database to be established by the European Commission. And then you would have the ones that the non-compliant wouldn't have those in place. The funny thing is, they could have very similar characteristics and features, and they could almost be the same, but by virtue of the fact that the regulated one has undergone those checks and has those systems in place versus the one that isn't, is a key differentiating factor there. Another thing that could be, so that's on the basis that they have similar features and characteristics. Another way of looking at it is if they're different. For example, if one has the data and feeding it in has good governance procedures and has been quality checked, it's, there's a good process to vet data before it goes into the system, versus one that ingests any information. Take, for example, a public large language model that inputs data from anyone and doesn't have any sort of control over the quality of data. That is going to pollute the quality on the output of the AI system versus the one that has good data governance in place. So those are two distinguishing factors there. What can developers expect? Well, like all things, regulation does bring some, it may take slightly longer to bring your product to market, and it may mean certain upfront costs and short-term pain in that sense. But what they can also expect is more support from industry bodies, from regulators, from legislators, and even capital providers. So we've even spoken with some venture capitalists and capital allocators that will not look at projects if they're not compliant with the regulation, or at least considering it. So if you're a developer looking to build a new product or upgrade an existing product or do anything related to that, strongly recommend having a look at this, because it's going to make your life a lot easier in the long run.
Would you agree? You already mentioned that, but I think it's worth stressing that the EU legislation does not just regulate the product, but it also regulates the company. You already mentioned quality management, risk management for the high risk and unacceptable risk systems. So, would you agree that you have to change your company if you want to go into EU market?
So I think it's important to distinguish that the EU Act does not regulate the company directly. So it regulates AI. And in this, we look at the legal definition of AI. So the academic, which is AI as we know it, so covering everything from LLMs, models, machine learning, whatever, versus the legal definition, what the EU AI covers, which is everything that's automated decision-making based on data. So every algorithm, model, system, or prompt that you have is now regulated. So even if you're, let's say, a non-regulated company, let's say construction company versus an investment bank or an asset manager or an insurance company, if you're using, developing, or supplying an AI system, you're in scope. So it's regulating the AI system, not the company. But that being said, companies will have to, they will be depending on their use of the system, they will expect to have complied with the regulation by extension. For example, the first compliance deadline for the EU Act is the 2nd of February 2025. By this time, any prohibited system under Article 5 must either be de-risked or decommissioned. Because if anyone is supplying, using, deploying, or otherwise interacting with the prohibited AI system, can incur a fine of 35 million euros or 7% of global annual turnover, whichever is greater.
Okay, so companies must take care also that their resellers or vendors do not sell to EU, or they are potentially liable for 7% of their turnover or 35 million, whichever is greater.
Spot on. And you've hit an interesting point there, Peter, as well. The liability aspect has been covered by a separate and complementary regulation or piece of legislation called the AI Liability Directive. So there's two key distinctions here. It's a directive, not a regulation. So a directive means that it's implemented at the discretion in a discretionary way by each member state, whereas a regulation is directly applicable in each member state. And secondly, it handles the liability. So the EU AI covers the rules and the risk-based approach of AI systems, whereas the liability aspect, which you cover, for example, as you mentioned there, if a company uses a prohibited system or indeed engages with a reseller, would face liability under the AI Liability Directive.
And there's immediately another question that I want to pose to you is the whole legislation does not include risk transfer, because usually we transfer risk, especially this potential fines and stuff, to insurers and insurance agencies. So is there a market in EU? Is anyone able or willing to accept the risk? Like, for example, you have an indemnity insurance that is omnipresent with all our professional services. We can always get indemnity insurance. But is it possible in EU for the outside company to get insurance against possible claims from the legislators?
That's a very good, slightly complex question. The best way to handle it is taking a step back and what is the what type of approach is the EUA Act? And it's, as you say, it's a risk-based approach. It has 4 risk levels: unacceptable, high, minimal, and limited. Now, the point of risk transfer is interesting, because if you have a high risk system, so you do the risk classification, and then if it's high risk, you would have to implement a risk management system under Article 9. And that risk management system would cover all aspects of the risk management framework, including risk transfer, risk treatment, risk mitigation, risk management. So, and I think a lot of the frustrations we're hearing at the market is, but the EUA Act is not specific enough. It's not prescriptive.
Mhm.
Well, I think, because if it took into account every single nuance and every single piece of granularity, everyone said it'd probably be 2,000 pages long. The fact that it mentions a risk management process and framework confers and actually very subtly implies that that is expected. So risk practitioners will know that if it says risk management system, it incorporates all those pieces. Whereas if people say, but it doesn't mention specifically mention risk treatment, whatever, that is implied and it's embedded, and it's likely to be issued in forthcoming implementing technical standards and guidance notes and these bits and pieces. But it is very specific, because, like I said, they've tried to be very as specific as possible, but for the sake of brevity as well, you've got to keep it condensed down, because the people who know this stuff know what it means.
Okay. Another question that is extremely important is it possible to enter EU market uh, with your or someone's AI app as a reseller or as a developer without an expert or a company like yours to help with compliance? Do you think this is possible? Because legislation, everything is available online, but is it possible to implement that without much experience?
It's an interesting question. I like to take a step back. If you were, for example, developing a medical device product, and you started the process of building it and trying investing and doing that stuff without the input of a medical expert who knew what the regulations were, who knew what the market is, who knew where it'd be most applicable and how to enter the market, you'd be running a big risk. And then the regulatory, reputational, operational, financial risks, etc., of doing that without a professional could significantly impact your chances of success. So if we use the medical device analogy to an AI product, a similar process could apply, because if people take the risk of, okay, we don't want to, these regulations may not, we think they're too much, they're too draconian, it's too prescriptive, it's going to slow our chances to market. It's a different marketplace. A year ago, sure, it may have been possible, but if we use that as an example, at AI Partners, we strongly recommend people to really consider the regulatory piece as part of their go-to-market.
Okay. Does that limit the access to the market, especially for smaller and higher risk apps, to small and medium-sized companies because of this entrance barrier, because of all the requirements and regulatory demands of risk management and quality control?
Again, this is a very typical question, and we are hearing this a lot from the market. What I think isn't articulated as clear as it could be, and what is well known, is for SMEs, startups, and scale-ups, there are a lot of exemptions available under the EU Act, because, and the European Commission have been very vocal on this when they've said they don't want to stifle innovation, they want to make sure it's a level playing field. So having a one-size-fits-all approach to everyone is going to disproportionately impact those types of firms in a negative way. So they are eligible for certain exemptions and innovation measures, maybe eligibility for grants and ability to fast track their products on the AI regulatory sandboxes and these bits and pieces. So I can see why people might think that, but the legislator has been very careful to make sure that this actually levels the playing field, instead of making it even harder for those innovative firms to grow and thrive.
Okay. Um, Another two questions I think that are important for all developers. Is it now almost uh, impossible to escape to hire an expert on regulation before entering the market in the same way as if you are signing a contract in a foreign land that you need a local lawyer?
It would be, you'd be running an extremely big risk. For example, if you didn't get any regulatory input and you tried to use, deploy, or supply an AI product or a model or an algorithm that has any subliminal features, for example, a lot of these used in advertising industry or the media, post 2nd of February, you run the risk of financial fines, restriction for the market, any reputational risk, and those types of things. So we can see that the real world impact is there, and we strongly recommend, in the same way that when you structure a company, you get the operations person, you get the finance person, you get the CEO, etc. Having an AI governance person is inevitable, and it just safeguards your business, because as we've seen, the uptake of AI is continuing to grow at an unprecedented pace, and knowing the risks and how to enter the market is going to distinguish the short-term businesses from the long-term ones.
Okay. Another important question for small companies. We know in legislation we have a bit of a shortcut if we use um, templates for different contracts and fees and non-disclosure agreements and stuff like that. They're much better than if we do them on their own, if they're good templates. Are there any templates available on the market right now or from the EU that would help small companies be compliant?
So it's important to note that I wouldn't recommend anyone to use just standard off the shelf templates that they obviously haven't checked and just assuming that someone else has used it, it's going to be okay. It's complete context specific. So to be very careful, strongly recommend anyone to be very, very careful with what they use. What I can say are two things. Guidelines, which I mentioned before, and implementing technical standards are actually being put together by the AI office as we speak, and will be released over the forthcoming months and weeks. And for any policies, processes, procedures, AI Partners has been doing that for over the course of 4 years. So we've covered the regulation from cradle to grave, almost in its first iteration. So we've used the practices of GDPR implementation and others to help companies, whether they're large, small, scale up SMEs, large enterprises. It doesn't really matter in that sense. But there is help out there, and it's just about taking the right steps at the right time.
Okay. So what is the first step that developer or reseller uh, should do before entering EU market in order to stay compliant or avoid all potential complications, litigations, fees, and similar?
Get an ISO 42001 pre-audit and understand and do an impact assessment to see where the regulation impacts your business and what your AI governance roadmap is.
How long does it usually take for this pre-audit? And how complex is this? Can a small company of like 5, 10 developers do that?
It doesn't prejudice whether you're a small 5-person company or one. And if we're using a measure of headcount, because I believe most businesses actually can achieve significant growth with only a few employees. So I don't necessarily believe headcount is a measure of how big a company is. But in that sense, it depends on the size, nature, scale, and complexity of a business, how readily information is available, what format it's in, etc., etc. But what we do say is it usually takes between 2 or 3 weeks and it depends. We've been doing that for clients for quite some time, but it does depend on the readiness and the quality of information. But like the AI industry, if you want to move fast, things can be done.
Okay, that is great news. What is the most important or when developing the new architecture for EU market, what should be, except for general compliance, but um, what should, let's say, a normal company AI developer avoid in order to avoid getting into unacceptable risk territory?
Don't cut corners, get it risk assessed. And if it is high risk and if you can't de-risk it, go with the compliance costs, because you will get asked this by your clients, you will get asked this by regulators, and you will get asked about internal auditors. So don't cut corners, and if it means a longer go to market, then the reality of the marketplace suggests that's the way to go. Like I said, it was different probably a year or two ago before the regulation came in place, but from the 1st of August 2024, it is now legally applicable to anyone with a presence or nexus in the EU. So just to reiterate that message.
Okay. Another thing that I read on the forums in different way, they say, and I would like your comment on that comment on the forums about EU regulation. They say that EU regulation is so tight that if we would compare it to the auto industry, that if someone robbed a bank and drove and an escape vehicle would be a Mustang, Ford would be fully liable for all the damages to the bank. Is that the case with EU legislation on the AI field, of course?
So I think and by the way, there's no right or wrong answer. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, so it's good to hear a diverse range of views. But we like to look at data and look at facts and what people have said. And it's some of the brightest minds in the world, everyone from Geoffrey Hinton, who won a Nobel Prize, to Yuval Noah Harari, a preeminent historian who's looked at this. And I like to paraphrase what Yuval said. He said that the thing about AI, the thing that distinguishes from every other piece of innovation in human history, including automobiles, is that it's the first technology that is capable of sentience. So whilst we're at very primitive forms today, it's only going to get smarter, it's only going to get more developed, and it's only going to get better. And by that, it's going to have agency and autonomy. So people say, yeah, it's overregulated today. We're talking, you're regulating it almost in its infant toddler stages. If it's going to continue to develop, the sentience aspect means it's going to be even more powerful and learn everything, every prompt, every piece of data you're looking at, it's learning from it. If you believe that you are the product, not the other way around, that is why it's so risky, because every piece of data it's learning. So of course it may seem draconian, it may seem overburdensome, but this is the most transformative. These people have been saying how transformative this piece of technology is. So I personally think that claims of being overregulation are somewhat insignificant compared to comments from some of the world leading minds.
Okay. And another question, or I'll say issue or challenge that a lot of developers or smaller developers are pointing out is that the app market right now is global, and there is some transfer of risk to the user. However, for example, from if there are apps from other markets and they're not EU compliant, but they are used by EU companies or EU citizens, they have unfair advantage compared to EU compliant apps. What's your take on that? How will EU regulate that?
I think it's fair to say that you always can have markets popping up everywhere. But if we use the GDPR analogy again, or example, it was seen as the global blueprint for data protection. Mm-hmm. So it affected everyone, even though companies didn't like it. Even companies in the APAC region, if they wanted to deal with the EU market, which is one of the world's largest trading blocks, then you have to comply with the standards. If you want to be totally ring fenced in your region and probably limit your commercial aspirations, sure. But if you have any presence or nexus connection to the EU, you have to comply with it. From an anti-competitive standpoint, but we always believe the quality of the product will obviously tell its stand its ground. But if you're not complying, you're going to cut yourself off. Look at Meta, for example. They've cut themselves off from the EU market, and since they've done that, there's been a lot of comments on that. Whether or not it's successful is, I guess, time will tell. But there's a lack of data at the moment to suggest how competitive it is, other than projections and estimations, and of course, it can be grounded in good data. But what is fair to say is that one of the EU's mandate is protect the consumer. We've got to make sure the consumer, so the individual, whether it's an employee at an investment bank or whether it's someone running a local bakery, any interaction with an AI system, you must ensure that their health, safety, and fundamental rights are protected at all costs.
I 100% agree on that with you. You mentioned something, and maybe it's worth stressing out again that the EU framework will probably be the something that every other community will look into before they decide on their AI legislation. Like you said, that was the case with GDPR. I think that is important to stress. So, can we say that right now the EU legislation is the most advanced in the world as far as AI regulation is concerned?
Well, there's different types of regulation. So you've got rules-based, principles-based, but from a rules-based perspective, I would agree with that statement. And we're seeing that, for example, the quotes or the examples you gave before about people claiming it's going to stifle innovation or be anti-competitive are actually implied compliments to its rigor and robustness. You people wouldn't be saying that if it wasn't so, again, exhaustive, rigorous, and robust. So I think going from these statements alone and public opinion and what companies are doing, it is the most comprehensive. And I'd like to add an additional element there, if I may. You said that if certain companies comply with the EU Act, they may be at a competitive disadvantage. I would argue all the way around. I'd argue that if you do comply with the EU AI Act, so you do get your ISO 42001, you do put these agreements in place, you're going to have a big advantage over those that don't, because you're going to be perceived as more trustworthy and have a better chance of success of selling your products to large enterprises and getting the opportunities. Because if you don't, you're running a huge risk, because those products that are relying on without any regulatory safeguards may have the best features, best functionality, but it's all a case of what risk does your product pose? Is it trustworthy? And the regulatory layer solidifies that trust.
Okay, that is a great point, and I do believe that making your product EU compliant is an advantage. I have another question that I think is important to address, and that is there's 27 states or independent states in EU, and every state has an opportunity to transfer legislation, so EU legislation in their local legislation. How complex will that be? Is that a problem for a developer? Because every market is a bit specific. Some markets, as we know in Europe, are much more protective for their local companies, and some markets have huge exemptions for small companies, medium-sized companies, and startups. How do you see the evolution of transferring this EU AI Act that we all believe that is solid and robust into local legislation? Will that make things worse? How will that influence the whole process?
Very interesting question. I probably don't have enough time for it, but I would say depends on the member state and their levels of level of institutionalization there and familiarity with the regulation. and attitude taken by the regulators. I'll give you a real life example. Last week, the Ireland announced 9 regulators to enforce the EU AI because one could say that they perceived that it was too much of a responsibility to enforce in just one regulator. So they have the combined input from 9 regulators to decide how it's going to be regulated and what's the best piece of legislation to enforce it and to implement it. So I think that's the approach taken by Ireland. Other member states may have a different approach. France, Germany may deem it they only need 1 or 2. Again, it depends on the level of institutional rigor of those countries and how prepared they are for this. But the important thing to note is if a country is operating cross-border, and let's face it, most technology companies are, and they have operations or marketing activities or clients or service or data, etc., in different member states, then the EU Act will apply in each one of those areas to which they have a presence. So it is important to bear in mind when you're doing your, like I said, the impact assessment and your regulatory exposure, how spread you are across the EU is you're going to be impacted by each regulator and their interpretation of it and what they decide to do. So it's interesting to bear that in mind.
Okay, how important is to get a good auditor for your software? Because we know that the big four are omnipresent in all 27 states. Is that a good route to go through and get one of the big four to audit your software in order to be to deem compliant in each member state?
I couldn't possibly say one prefer one company over another or a consortium of companies, but what I can say is that it is important to assess your risk level because the risk level determines what you have to do. So of the 4 risk levels, if you're high, then you would have to do certain things like bias mitigation. May have to do auditing and all those bits and pieces. I believe there are a lot of companies out there. So and it depends on what you're auditing as well. So we could use you could do for example, the ISO 42001, which I mentioned before, which is seen as the de facto standard for the EU AI Act, specifically covering AI risk management. You would have to be a certified auditor to do those assessments. And we are seeing that as a good way to differentiate yourself. If you're talking about the technical audit of the AI system itself, then those would be applicable to high risk systems. So it really depends on what you're auditing and why. So because we see that term used quite loosely, so we want to make sure that people know exactly what they're auditing and why, not just getting an audit for the sake of getting an audit, because these things, as you probably know, are fairly time intensive and resource intensive as well.
Hey, well, thank you very much for that lovely interview. We're going to take a brief intermission, and we will be right back with the first panel discussion of the AI Expo. So we'll see you in about 15 minutes. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Peter, for this wonderful interview. We'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.